Welcome to the Corporate Soul podcast. It's good to have you back. I'm Tyler Norton, and it's a real treat for me to be able to share some thoughts with you here on this session. I've wanted to zoom in a little bit tonight, this evening as I shoot this, into the concept of where does leadership fit in the corporate soul concept. I don't think you can in any way imagine building a strong corporate culture that kind of reflects your ethos and beliefs without really starting to explore where does leadership fit in all of that. And one of my favorite things to do in these podcasts is share from my favorite books over the years that have been given to me. I'll never forget this one. My favorite book on leadership is called The Leadership Challenge. It was written by Barry Posner and Jim Coos. They both teach business at Santa Clara University and are sought-after speakers, and for several decades actually have been teaching and coaching on leadership in both university and non-university settings. This book was given to me by a gentleman who was a mature agency manager when I was the youngest general manager in my company. I had been told that this was a 165-year-old company at the time. I had been told that I was the youngest general manager in the history of the company. I was scared to death. I was in a job I shouldn't have been in my late 20s, and really felt a need to up-level my leadership skills. And this particular book was given to me as a gift from a manager from Southern California by the name of Jim Moore, who said, "Tyler, this book has almost been a leadership Bible for me throughout my career," and he was kind enough to share it with me. And I have since probably read it multiple times, taught much from it in different settings along the way. And so I want to start the podcast by telling you and giving credit to Jim Coos and Barry Posner and their great work in the Leadership Challenge. The first edition of which, if I'm not mistaken, was published several decades ago, and I think it's in its 7th published edition, and upwards of 2 million copies around the world in more than 20 languages. So highly recommended, and much of what I'll be sharing with you this evening on the podcast will come from some of the lessons I've learned from them. I want to start by suggesting that there is no real ethos or corporate soul without a form of leadership that people want to follow. And Jim Coos and Barry Posner over the years have administered a survey. I believe the first year that they administered this survey, if you can imagine this, was all the way back to 1987. And the survey is titled The Characteristics of the Most Admired Leaders. So it's actually written from the perspective of a constituent or someone who wants to follow a leader. What are the characteristics that they most want to find in a leader that they want to follow? And what I find fascinating about this survey that they've administered, not only in 1987, but subsequently, I believe every couple of years they've done it, up until as early as 2017, or as late, as 2017. Here's a survey that lists all sorts of characteristics of leadership, none of which are necessarily bad, but there's probably upwards of 30 or 40 of them. In fact, I've pulled up some of those leadership characteristics here. So dependable, supportive, fair-minded, competent, intelligent, honest, forward-looking, caring, imaginative, loyal, straightforward, mature, self-controlled, even independent. So you've got this long list of all very positive leadership characteristics and traits that are put in front of any number of people. What makes this such a fascinating study is they now have data on the responses, not only from 1987 all the way up into the late 20-teens, but they also have it in virtually on every continent in the world and across a broad range of macro and economic realities, geopolitical realities, economic realities. So we're talking about pre-internet, for example, post-internet. We're talking about in robust economies and in down economies that are cyclically down into recession. And I think that's an interesting point as you consider. So have the characteristics of admired leaders changed over time? Have people kind of pivoted as we've moved into a technology-driven world, away from maybe some of the post-World War II leadership dynamics? Really kind of a fascinating study. And what they found is in that very, very first year in 1987, there were 4 characteristics that ranked highest from this broad laundry list of characteristics for most admired leaders. And the characteristics that ranked highest in 1987 were honest, forward-looking, inspiring, and competent. So the first 4 in 1987 were honest, those characteristics that were most admired in leaders: honesty and integrity. Forward-looking, so some sort of strategic and not just focused on today or tactically driven, but actually with some foresight, outlook into the future. They were inspiring. They had the ability to awaken a sense of we can do this in other people, and they were competent. Those were the 4 in 1987. Well, I'll jump to the punchline in the message that I want to share with you guys tonight, and that is that the actual reality is that every year that they did this study, whether they did it in India, whether they did it in South America, in the United States, over to Europe, in Asia, no matter where they administered the study, guess what happened every year and has happened every year since they started this almost some 35, 40 years ago? And the answer is honest, forward-looking, inspiring, and competent have prevailed in every survey, in every continent, in every economic reality and situation. These are the characteristics of most admired leaders that these gentlemen, Barry Posner and Jim Coos, who wrote the book, The Leadership Challenge, have said over the test of time and the test of economies, even shifting into from service economies into technologies and all sorts of shifts and pivots, it has always prevailed that what people are looking for in their leader, the one they want to follow, is honesty, a forward-looking mindset, and ability to see and have a vision into the future. They want to be inspired by that leader, and they want to know that there's a level of competence and expertise that they have. So as you think about the journey and what we're trying to talk about on these podcasts, whether you're a sole proprietor in your own business, leading yourself and maybe not a whole lot of other employees, or whether you're a partner, whether you're an entrepreneur in a home-based business, whether you're a leader of a large corporation, in any real situation where you might find yourself where you wear the hat of a leader, those 4 characteristics are the hallmarks of most admired and the leaders that people most want to follow. As I was studying this book early on in my career and wanting to become a better leader, I started to ask myself, so, how do I develop those characteristics the most? And if you read this book, you'll see that they kind of summarize those 4 characteristics into source credibility. And I think that's a really powerful concept in leadership. Is they said, if you really said, what does it all boil down to, even with honest and forward-looking and inspiring and competent? What Coos and Posner did was they summarized really what was this all about. And the upshot of their leadership surveys really pointed at one thing, and that is credibility. That the ultimate game is that leaders need to be credible. And when a leader is honest, it inspires source credibility. When a leader has the ability to be forward-looking, anticipating, seeing external and internal forces on their own business or leader, whatever leadership setting they're in, that becomes more credible. Obviously, if they're inspiring, they create a sense of credibility and believability. And then lastly, this notion of competence. Clearly, competence and source credibility go together. And as they continued to explore the relationship that they've seen over decades of studying and teaching about leadership, they talk at length about what they refer to as the 5 practices of exemplary leaders or of exemplary leadership. So if you thought, okay, first and foremost, on my leadership journey, what people really want to know is, am I honest? Do I have the ability to kind of see, the way I think about it, the metaphor I've used in many different settings is kind of where the puck is going on the ice. Wayne Gretzky said, they said one time, why do you succeed? He goes, I skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck has been. I think that's a good example of being forward-looking, right? You're mindful of where are things going in my industry, where are things going in my area of focus as a leader. And by being able to anticipate and moving your organization towards those things, you tend to have greater credibility. Clearly, the inspiring piece makes sense to me, that people want to follow someone that inspires them and speaks from a place of conviction, and it really triggers an emotional response of credibility. And then the competence thing makes a lot of sense. You've probably heard of or read Malcolm Gladwell's book on outliers and the concept of 10,000 hours, that really no one starts to move into any level of expertise until they've really amassed a certain baseline amount of experience in an area that enables them to be really, really good at something. And as they were talking about these practices of exemplary leadership, they said, if a leader can really establish that source credibility through those 4 characteristics, and of course the others are important as well, but these 4 seem to be kind of the top 4 year over year and decade after decade. But they also say that if you summed it up as credibility, source credibility, and they have an acronym under do what you say you will do. They say at the end of the day, leaders who do what they say they will win the day on that source credibility metric or measurement. And then they say, but the great leaders really focus on 5 practices of exemplary leadership. And I just want to touch on these briefly this evening as we have this brief kind of check-in on the leadership side of things in the corporate soul. Number 1, leaders model the way. An important principle that they teach. Leaders model the way. This speaks to clarifying and establishing their own values, able to articulate those. We've talked a lot about the principle side of corporate soul. How well can you articulate your values? How well does your team know them? And it's interesting to note that they've done a lot of studies on whether it's organizational values or even personal values that the leader can both point to and articulate. They found a higher correlation with a leader that can articulate and is committed to a set of very personal values, or what I would refer to in some of these podcasts as principles, right? Focusing on principles over ego and economics. That person that can articulate their personal values and is strong at articulating the organizational values tends to have a greater impact overall on their leadership journey. So this concept of modeling the way says, can you not only do you have a set of personal values and priorities that matter to you, and have you been effective at sharing those and communicating with those so that people can read from that and get a sense as to who you are? Once you're modeling the way, and there's certainly more commitments to that practice of exemplary leadership, but that's just an example of one of them that they get into. The second practice of exemplary leadership that is discussed in this book at length is, now that you've modeled the way and you've kind of got yourself set around your core values, your job is to inspire a shared vision. And I love the concept of inspiring a shared vision, reminding you that one of the 4 characteristics of admired leadership was inspiring. Well, their definition of leadership, and I'll say this parenthetically to these practices, is leadership is the art of mobilizing a group of people to want to struggle for a shared aspiration or a shared vision. So I'll say it again. Leadership is the art of mobilizing, moving. You get that sense of moving a group of people, right, who want to struggle. I love that phrase, who want to struggle for what? For a shared aspiration. Well, the leader's job is to inspire that shared aspiration in the form of a shared vision, and take the time to articulate it in a way that others have a chance to metabolize it, make sense of it, and then choose to opt in and engage in the process. This notion of, I want to struggle. And I think it's important also to think, Coos and Posner maintain that leaders necessarily aren't born, that leadership is a skill you develop over time as you become more adept at kind of seeing and understanding how people work. And that's why they refer to it more as an art. You learn the art of mobilizing people to want to struggle. By definition, most people don't want to struggle until they have some sense of shared vision or aspiration, something worth it. And leaders are really good at inspiring that shared vision. So backing up, just by way of summary, we've discussed the 4 characteristics of admired leaders. Excuse me. Number 1 is honest. Number 2 is forward-looking. Number 3 is inspiring. And number 4 is competent. A leader that has those as kind of central to who they are and can exhibit that to other people through consistency, doing what they say they'll do, becomes a source credible leader. And they talk a lot about credibility as being kind of the bedrock or foundational element of really, really strong leadership. And with those characteristics in hand and remembered and prioritized in your leadership journey, the next thing you want to do is say, so what are the 5 practices that I need to show and exemplify as I lead a group of people, as I mobilize a group of people to want to struggle for a shared aspiration? First one is model the way. Be clear about your values. Don't ask people to do things that you're not willing to do. Demonstrate that you're fully invested with them. That's number 1. Number 2 is then to take that, once they know that you're modeling the way and you have these characteristics, now inspire a shared vision. And take some time and articulate that vision so that people have real clarity on, okay, this is what we're trying to do and accomplish here. And I enlist in that vision. I want to struggle with you for that shared aspiration. The third thing, if you can kind of see how this logic flow goes, is once you've established a vision, leaders, the third practice of exemplary leadership is they challenge the process. You've probably heard the old story that a granddaughter asks her mother why we cut the ends of the ham off when we put it in the oven. And the mother says, I don't know. Grandma always used to do that. Let's ask Grandma. So they get on the phone and they call Grandma and say, Grandma, why did you cut the ends of the ham off before you put it in the oven? Of course, they were thinking, did you let it breathe? Does it cook faster or better or taste better? And she said, I just didn't have a pan or a pot that would fit the ham, so I had to cut the ends off. That's interesting, isn't it, to think about? No one had challenged the process of that until 2 generations later and said, why are we cutting the ends of the ham off? Leaders, the third practice of exemplary leadership, leaders are willing to challenge a process. Having worked in many different corporations and seen how artifacts can emerge over time, the way we did something can be, well, we've always done it that way. Good leaders at the right time will come in and rationalize it and say, why are we doing it this way? Is there a good reason for this? And that challenge of process can actually highlight inefficiencies. It can draw attention to maybe things that have been more opinionated or a bias that's an artifact from many years ago, and just creates an environment where people are comfortable asking questions about, can we do this better? So again, number 1, model the way. Number 2, inspire a shared vision. Okay, and then number 3, be willing and engaged in challenging the process when appropriate. Not necessarily for challenge sake. I've definitely worked with some people who I thought abused that practice of leadership, but definitely being that person that's willing to look and say, hey, where do we need to challenge process in order to keep ourselves moving forward? The fourth practice of exemplary leadership is great leaders enable others to act. They enable action. If you think about it, it makes sense, right? I'm modeling the way. I've made a really clear declaration of the shared vision. You've enlisted in that. I'm willing and open and even inspiring people to challenge process, look at things that we can do better, be always inquisitive and always curious about what we can do to improve. And then it moves us to, now I want to enable others to act. And sometimes people in organizations can get stuck, and the great leaders are the one that remove the barriers to one's own motivation. They understand that I need to get people moving forward from their own place of motivation, not necessarily from my motivation. And so they enable others to act. What could that look like? Could be structure, could be teams. It could be relooking at how people work together to try to optimize outcomes for them working together. Clarity about strategy and execution, right? How well do people know what it is we're doing on an execution level? If you've inspired the shared vision, you've given them a sense of where you want to go. Now the question becomes, well, how? How do we get there? Which is always tied back to strategy on a macro level and then down to initiative levels on a tactical level. And so you say, good leaders enable others to act. They give them the clarity they need, maybe the chalk lines on the field and the rules of engagement. Now everyone knows. Now they say it's time to move forward and to act. So that fourth practice of exemplary leadership, according to the Leadership Challenge book that I'm kind of doing a review on tonight, is this concept of, can you enable other people to move and to act? And then the last one, probably, in my opinion, the most important, and the one that I think differentiates the good leaders or the great leaders from the good leaders, is the last practice of exemplary leadership, is the idea of great leaders encourage the heart. You know, as you set out to do something that is a meaningful shared aspiration, to take a group of people, one of my great mentors said, his definition of leadership is taking people to a place they've never been before. If you stop and think about that for a while, that is a really powerful concept. As a leader, do I take people to a place that they've never, ever been to before? And when leaders do that, invariably there's setbacks and challenges. Invariably there's things you say, you know what, this is really, really hard. And there are moments when you need to encourage the heart. And it outlines in the book several commitments to that practice of encouraging the heart. Recognizing contributions, celebrating success, and also having the awareness and sensitivity when you see key players on the team that might be struggling a little bit with their own sense of engagement, or even if they're winning or not. So I think it's important as we talk, and I will continue to kind of layer in some podcasts just about leadership in general. I believe that all of us are on a leadership journey, and it doesn't matter if that's as a parent, that doesn't matter if you're a small business owner or a home-based business owner or any number of other things. We're all enlisted in the game of leadership the second we step out and endeavor to do something. And I think it's just an important concept for us to always remember that where does leadership fit in the journey of developing a corporate soul? And it starts with your own characteristics of leadership, the things that you're committed to living true to. Remembering that for 30 plus years, the survey has said honesty, forward-looking, inspiring, and then the last one being competence. Those four things are the most admired surveyed leadership characteristics for many, many decades. And I think you want to ask yourself, how am I doing on those areas? Do I signal confidence in honesty and in being forward-looking, which speaks to kind of the outlook of a shared vision into the future? Am I developing my own competencies, and am I inspiring? Those are good check-ins for you as a leader. And then the 5 practices. Remember these. Model the way. Right? Remember that your job is to step forward and not ask people to do something you're not willing to do. Be able to articulate your personal values as well as the organizational values so that people can get a sense as to who you are in that regard. You model the way, right? You inspire a shared vision. You now tell them where we want to go, and you can involve them in designing that vision, but definitely inspire it. Be willing to stand up and say, this is where we need to go. In the process, you're willing to challenge how we've done things always. So challenging the process is number 3. Enabling others to act is clearing away any barrier to their own motivation. Clarity of thought, clarity of alignment and resources and what we're trying to do. Even structure can point to enabling others to act. And then, of course, lastly is encourage the heart. And taking time to thank people, acknowledge people, recognize contributions appropriately, such that people really feel like, you know what, that hard work I put forward did matter, and someone was watching. And frankly, it feels great to be recognized and to be encouraged to keep moving forward towards that shared aspiration that I want to struggle for. So it's something that I feel really strongly about. I want to touch in throughout these podcasts, and this is a little bit shorter podcast on leadership. I hope it's helpful for you and something that you can ponder and reflect on in your leadership journey. I know I do. I keep saying to myself, how am I doing with this? To bring it back full circle, The gentleman that shared this book with me years ago had a copy in his briefcase at the time that was just utterly tattered. It looked like he had Post-it notes layered into it and had handwritten all over it. And he pulled it out. It literally looked like a reference guide. He called it his Bible, and he had it so marked and so lined out with the things that he needed to improve. He says, whenever I get off center on my leadership journey, I pull this out and I check back in with those 5 practices. And throughout the book, you'll see there's commitments to each practice that really point at things you can improve. So if you want to get better as a leader in the journey of your own corporate soul, then maybe check in on these 5 practices, check in on these characteristics of admired leaders, and give yourself an assessment, and then build out an approach each week, quarter, and month and quarter to try to say, hey, I need to get better in these 5 practices of leadership along the way. I hope you will take the time to consider that and can see how that connects back with the whole mission of what we're doing with these podcasts.